I like making a nice sound. This is what I say about my students, about being musicians who play the bass. And that's what I think I learned from Posta, because Posta was about beauty of sound.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. So glad to have you here today. Visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what's going on here. And send me an email, reach out, find me on social media. I love to hear from you. Facebook, Twitter, whatever, or email me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. I know you're going to love today's story with David Hayes. And David is one of those names in the double bass world that, like Frank Proto or Francois Rabath or other such guests, you should know that name already. David has commissioned over 500, yes, that's 500 pieces for the double bass. He founded Recital Music over 20 years ago, and he's published works by Tony Osborne, Simon Garcia, Teppo Hauta-Aho, Bert Turetsky, so many other names that are just core to the double bass world. David's also gotten into composition himself. After only 3 years of composing, he's already had music performed in 8 different countries. And he's an avid writer about the double bass. He's written for The Strat and other publications like that. And then he's created these fantastic Facebook pages. One's called Bass Notes. Another one's called A History of the Bass in 100 Compositions. I'll link up to these. If you haven't checked him out, or even if you have checked him out, go through and just see what David's put together. It's remarkable. We'll feature 4 excerpts from David. We'll start with a recording from this wonderful Tribute to Teppo 4 CD set that was just released. You'll be hearing Eric's ballad. We'll start with that. Then you'll hear David's own composition, The Last Poppy, for bass trio, and Simon Garcia's Al Andalus. Both are live performances from David's recital at Bass 2016 in Prague. And then we'll wrap up with another piece by Teppo, performed by David, called The Last Summer. And I'd like to thank D'Addario Strings for sponsoring the podcast and let you know a little bit about their Zyx strings, which I just put the medium Zyx on my bass a couple days ago and love the sound. I'll play a couple notes for you here at some point on the podcast, but they're great strings. They're synthetic core. They're colorful. They got a gut-like quality. They have great attack, great sustain for pizzicato. Bow response is excellent. So they're a really excellent hybrid string for whatever kind of music you happen to be playing. They're American-made, designed, engineered, and crafted in New York at the D'Addario factory. So thank you, D'Addario, for sponsoring the podcast. And I know you're going to enjoy this conversation with David Hayes. I am on the line with David Hayes, who's a man who really needs no introduction. If you are involved at all in the bass world, he has just made such a massive contribution, and I'm so thrilled to have him on the podcast. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jason. It's really nice to actually talk to you. And it's fantastic to meet you in Prague a few weeks ago.
Oh, it was so much fun. I mean, what a great event. And that's just what it's all about for me. That, and I got a chance to see your recital, and it was just wonderful in every way, the playing and the program. And I have so many questions, so many things we can dig into, but maybe we can just start at the beginning. Tell us how you got started in music.
I think I was about 7, and I started playing the recorder at school. It was as simple as that. We had one teacher who liked music, and she just started a recorder class. And I started. I found I was quite good at it, so I progressed on to a treble recorder. I can't remember what it's called now. It's a long time ago. And then guitar. And then I went to secondary school, which I think is your high school. Mm-hmm. And then I did well in music exams. So I had percussion lessons and viola. And then when I was 14, I started the bass. And that was it. And from 14, it's like the bass took hold of me and it hasn't let go yet. And it's an amazing journey. So it's been, I think, 42 years so far. And maybe I'm more passionate and enthusiastic now than I've ever been, but I've always been passionate. I met a friend when I was studying in London, and I hadn't seen him for many years. And he said, because I thought I was only passionate now. And he said, oh, no, you were like that 25 years ago, 30 years ago. So I was quite amazed, really. I just thought I thought my passion had grown and grown. And it hasn't. Obviously, it's been there from day one. But I love it. I absolutely love the bass. And I love everything about it. And from the time I get up to the time I go to bed, I'm really a bass nut. I absolutely love it.
It's there's no better thing than that. That's that. I think you're preaching to the choir for people who are listening to this. You know, it must have been so cool going back to Prague, you know, and you studied in Prague. Could you maybe just speak a little bit about that experience?
Well, it was a fantastic experience, and it came about because when I was studying in London, I read an article in the ISB by Rodney Slatford about double bass in Czechoslovakia. And really that's where most of our heritage comes from, and the history and the playing and the repertoire. And then I had the great fortune to meet Posta at the Isle of Man competition in 1982. And I said, could I come and study with you? And he said yes. And we went in 1986. So this year is the 30th anniversary of my first lessons with Posta. And in 1986, it was still communist rule. It was completely different. And we had to get a visa. But because we were going privately, we couldn't get a visa until a week before we flew. And there was no guarantee of getting a visa. So you had to book your flights. And then we had to queue to the Czech embassy in London and to get a visa. And we had to pay in cash. They wouldn't take checks or anything like that. And then we got that. And then we got to Prague. And then we had to change currency. They wanted our currency. And then I think Posta's daughter, Jitka, was there to meet us. And we've been friends with Jitka for 30 years. Now, in fact, we had lunch with Jitka while we were in Prague. And we always meet up every time we go to Prague. But it was amazing because it was completely different. It was everything was closed. And I think Czechoslovakia was more open than many of the communist countries. But even so, it was still completely different. And I had lessons at Posta's mother-in-law's house. We stayed with her for 2 weeks. And when I studied in London, I had 30 one-hour lessons for a year, each year. When I was in Prague over 2 weeks, I had 27 hours of lessons.
Wow.
And it was unbelievable. My head was just full. I couldn't take any more, really. But Posta used to come and he used to say, I'm a little bit busy today. I can't stay long. And 3 hours later, he would still be there because he loved teaching. He was as passionate. And he was fantastic because I was able to study all the Czech repertoire, which we couldn't find in the West. And he had copies of all these things. And we just had a most wonderful time. It was really fantastic. And most of my happy memories are of Prague. We go back once or twice a year, which is nice. And now I go and visit Posta's grave just to pay my respects and lay some flowers. And I've told some of my students, when I'm no longer here, that's their job. They have to remember Posta. Because he was such a big figure. He was fantastic. He was a stickler. He was quite tough. And sometimes he would tell me something, and if I didn't understand, he wouldn't tell me again. That was it. And he would sit at the piano, and he knew everything from memory. He didn't use any music. And sometimes I'd be playing the Grancino double bass, which was absolutely amazing. And Posta would just say, no, down bow there. No, up bow. No, second finger. And it was really quite to the point. But we got through so much repertoire. And I heard him play the last night we were there. He had a mini recital. So we were able to go and see him. And his sound was magnificent and his musicality. And I always tell my students, they must be musicians who play the bass. And this has really come through all my teachers. And I was so lucky to have Posta. And not one day goes by I don't think about him. And when I'm teaching, I think about him. And I try to make sure that every bow counts. And the sound is always musical. And you're always thinking about the music. You're not thinking about the bass. But Posta used to sing. One of his records was called The Singing Grancino of Frantisek Posta. And one of the nice things was I used to play music by Frantisek, who died in 1940. And Czerny had owned the Grancino bass before Posta's teacher. So sometimes I used to play Czerny's music on Czerny's old bass. So the heritage is fantastic. It's really amazing.
Wow, that Grancino bass is so. I remember seeing photos of that bass. Just, what a magnificent instrument!
It was so funny because Posta was much shorter than me, and it didn't really have a movable end pin. It had an end pin, but it was fixed, and I was much taller, so I had to balance this priceless bass on a pile of music, and it meant I couldn't move the bass, because if I moved it, the bass would just suddenly, this priceless instrument, it was unbelievable. I just had to keep the thing upright. It was so strange to do that. But just to be able to play his bass was fantastic.
Oh, how cool is that? Those 3-hour lessons. I mean, what a magnificent mentor.
He didn't change. He loved teaching, absolutely loved it. And he loved to pass on his knowledge and his passion. And he was a great teacher. He was a really great teacher. And he's still so respected around the world. And it's nice, in 2019 is his centenary. He would have been 100. So I'm going to organise something to remember Posta. And every 5 years, I think it's when he would have been 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, I've organised something. Either we've commissioned music or we've had a concert in his memory. And it's just a good way of the younger players learning who Posta was. Because now he's from the past. He died in 1991. He's not my past. He's still in my lifetime. It was funny as well. I remember sitting on the train with him, talking about Adolf Mizek. And again, Mizek died, I think, 1954, 55. So to us, he's a name from history. We all play his sonatas, but know very little about him. And he said, oh yeah, I met him once. And I'd never met anybody who'd met Mizek. And he said, I think I was about 20, and I was playing his second sonata. And he was in the audience. He came up afterwards to say how much he'd enjoyed it. Wow, he's met Mizek. That's unbelievable. I've never met anybody else who met Mizek. It's astounding, really.
That's so cool. I love being able to see back into history like that, and just those connections. And so what an amazing connection. And so how many commissions are you up to at this point? How many pieces have you
I think it's over 500.
Over 500. Wow. Well, okay. So there are like so many things I want to know about that. But what was the very first commission you ever did? That
was at 1981, and I'd met Sarah, my wife, at music college, and she's a soprano, as you know. And I had some songs by a composer called Betty Rowe, who is English, lives in London, for soprano and bass. And I managed to find her address, and I just wrote to her. And I have no idea how you did it. I have no idea what it would cost. But I thought, if I don't ask, I'm certainly not going to get any more. So I just wrote to her, and I got a lovely letter back. And we went to meet her and her husband. And then we worked with Betty and her husband, John, for many, many years. They're great people. And I think I had maybe 3 or 4 commissions from Betty. And she's still going strong. John died a few years ago. I think she's maybe late 80s now, and she's still examining and adjudicating, and she's still as passionate as ever. She was a fantastic character. And she wrote, I think it was called Cat and Mouse, which is published by York Edition. And they were written for Sarah and I. And that's how it started. And then I played in a bass quartet when I was at music college. And I just asked all the composers I met, would you like to write for us? But being at music college, they're trying out all their new ideas. They're not traditional, and everything was really difficult and really didn't fit the bass. But they still exist, which is fantastic. Because what I like was the fact that they would try. That's really fantastic. And that's what I've been able to do with composers. I love trying to fire their enthusiasm for the bass, because I can't imagine many wake up thinking, I must write a bass concerto today.
Right.
It's really not the top of their list, is it really? It's either another symphony or an opera or a piano concerto or something. Really, double bass really isn't in there. And I think I just have I don't know how, well, you said maybe just the confidence or the passion just to ask. Because if you don't ask, you don't get.
Well, it's just amazing. I mean, like, just the folks listening, just think about that for a minute. Over 500 pieces. I mean, and just the contribution that is to the bass world. I mean, I'm thinking about myself. I've commissioned a grand total of 2 pieces. I feel extremely.
But that's 2 more. That's two more. That's fantastic.
That's true. But I gotta up my output of that. I'd love to know, because so many people, if they hear the name David Hayes, the first thing they would think of is recital music. And when did you get the idea to start recital music?
I started playing the bass, as I said, when I was 14. And the British system is we have graded exams. And you get to a certain level and you take an exam, then you work towards the next exam. It's called the Associated Board Schools of Music. They do exams in about, I think, 120 countries. And they had a syllabus for double bass. And I managed to get hold of this. And I kept seeing York edition, York edition, York edition. So I wrote to them for a catalogue. And then I just started buying everything. I bought every piece they published. And then I found other publishers and I started buying everything there. I thought, well, I'd quite like to do this. So I had some ideas when I was still at school. I must have been about 17. I thought, how do I do it? I don't know how I do it. And then I got to London, and then I went to the British Library and saw the Dragonetti manuscripts and copied out the concerto. And then I had a great friend I met in 1983, and he was a neurologist, a doctor, and really passionate about the bass. And we talked for 29 years. He died about 6 years ago. And he was as passionate about the bass as I was. And Mark helped me set up Recital Music. It was as simple as that. I'd come back from Prague and I brought all this music back, which no one had ever seen over here. And we just started publishing. And it was really difficult because in those days there were no computers. So we had to have the music. It was done by a notaset. And it was all rubbed. It was about £15 a page. That would be about $15 a page, which in those days was a lot of money. And so it meant it was difficult to publish because you just couldn't afford it. And I just started, and then I found another piece, and another piece, and another piece. And I'm always passionate about this. I always wanted to leave a legacy that I always wanted. I wanted the bass world to be slightly different because of me. And the publishing just happened and happened. Then I met Tony Osborne, fantastic composer, and then I met other composers. And then little by little, it just grew and grew. We did workshops and concerts, so I always needed new repertoire. Tony was fantastic at writing new pieces for us, many other composers. I started arranging. And when you start arranging for bass, the easiest way to find out how good it is to put it in front of the players. And they'll tell you straight away if it's good or if it isn't. And I have to say, many of the ones I've done have been okay. A couple have been disasters, absolute disasters. I did a transcription of a Consolation by Franz Liszt, a piano piece for 5 basses. And it was horrible. It didn't have one redeeming feature. It's unbelievable. It just turgid from note 1 to the end. And I think we played through a rehearsal by students, and there was just silence at the end. And I couldn't think of what to say, so that went straight in the bin. But then other ones like the Can-Can I did for 4 basses, and that took 10 attempts until I got there. And then I'm really quite pleased with that. So the publishing just grew and grew. And it's just little by little. It's quite difficult to do it when you have no funding and you have no money. But it's never bothered me. I like challenges.
Well, and it's so great. I mean, talk about, I totally identify with that feeling of leaving a legacy. And
which is what you're doing. It's fantastic.
Well, right. As you're saying that, I couldn't help but think about that. But what a great, because I often think just how ephemeral a performance is. You know, like I played this concert and there's the applause and it's great, but then that moment's gone. But bringing all these commissions into the world and motivating people to write for the bass and then publishing. And I played many of your pieces over the years. I've used them with my students, you know, recital music. So if I go over to my library, there are quite a few pieces. I wish more people would do what you're doing because it just has such a profound impact on the bass world.
Well, the other thing I found out is talking to other players and teachers, and they say what they want. And it took me a long time to realize that it's like a pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid, the beginners. And the higher you get, the fewer there are players. And I used to publish all this virtuosic music, which I used to love playing myself. But so many people would say, well, I like it, but I couldn't play it and I wouldn't teach it. So I suddenly realized it's the lower level where we need repertoire. It's the beginners. And that's where people like Tony Osborne are fantastic. And Tony's one of those composers. I can phone him and I can say, you've got 3 notes, you've got 2 rhythms, and could you write me a piece? And he'll do it straight away. He's absolutely amazing. And also, I found now, being a composer myself, how nice it is to have challenges. I saw Frank Proto in Prague, and I hadn't met Frank before, and he was, wow, he's one of my heroes, one of my bass heroes. And it was like, we've been friends forever. It was fantastic. He sent me some music this week, and most wonderful inscriptions that he's written inside them. It's, wow, I can't believe one of my heroes has said such nice things about me. I was telling Frank that in Sonata 1963, which I was teaching to one of my students, the first movement only has 2 piano chords. The rhythms change, but it's just two jazz chords. And I set myself a challenge of doing that. I did different chords, and then I varied the rhythms. And it's a great challenge to a composer to have limitations. I've got to write some pieces for a competition in Spain in February, and I've just got too much time and too many ideas. I need him to say, I need it next week, and then I'll come up with a title and I'll write it. But at the moment, I've got 4,000 ideas, so I have 4,000 titles as well. So I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. But when there's a deadline, I'm really good. I get my head in gear then.
Oh, I love that. Well, that reminds me. I was talking with Frank about a similar thing. You said someone was, I think one of the military bands was commissioning a piece from him, and it was going to be over a year later was the commission day. That's way too long. Right? And I love that the idea of limitations, and yeah, it can actually help just to structure your creativity. Boy, those Tony Osborne pieces. You want to talk about somebody who does such, like you're saying, such a magnificent job with just a few notes, like the green bass blues. I can't tell you how many times I've done that with my beginning bass quartet. I mean, that's really interesting.
Well, I first met Tony, it must be 20, 25 years ago now. And I taught in Berkshire, in a place called Reading. And that he was one of the main teachers in the area. And I got his address and just wrote to him. And I said, I've heard you've written some bass music. Could I buy some copies? And he sent me this enormous pile of music, all hand copied. And there was the Pink Elephant and Green Bass Blues, Pastime of Good Company, Habanera, some trios. And then we met up, and we've been firm friends ever since. And maybe Tony's written, 75 pieces for me. But he has such facility and such talent. It's unbelievable. I used to say to him, where does it come from? Where do your ideas come from? And I think he just said, well, they're sort of there. And I sat with him once, and he'd written a quartet for me. And it was being played on the computer. And as we were going through, he was telling me the story of the piece. And wow, I'm sitting with this composer, and he's telling me this story of this piece. How lucky am I? And then I did when we were in Prague, I did a workshop, and I was talking about a piece I'd written, Postcards from Prague, which is dedicated to Posta. And it's just 7 little pieces. And they said, would I play something? I said, yeah, and shall I tell you about it? So I talked as I played. And I was able to tell them the history of each little piece and because the first one was, we went to Prague, it's still communism, so we were really unsure, it's all different. And then the final one is, every time I come away from Prague, I'm a little bit sad, but I do know I'm coming back. And the penultimate one is the old town square now, too many tourists. So it's really fast and vibrant. And then there's well, Posta didn't like jazz, he wasn't into jazz. And I had to put some jazz in because it's so popular in Prague, 16 seconds of jazz. And I thought he'd let me get away with that. And it's so interesting, I think, when a composer talks through their music and you hear what they'd intended. I'm going to record all my pieces. We're doing a CD in January, and then I'm going to record them all for YouTube, because I want people to know what I'd written and how I'd meant it to be. If you choose to do it differently, that's fine. If you play my music, I'm more than happy. I have no problem with that at all. But I wanted to put down my version to give an idea of how I'd heard it, how I'd imagined it. That's the other thing, composing. I didn't realize how difficult it was to write it down. Because you might have the idea, but you've got to write it down so that someone else can understand it. Is it in 3/4? Is it in 2/4? Is it in 4/4? Is it in a key? Is it atonal? Does it have bar lines? Does it not have bar lines? It's fascinating. I've learned so much, and now I listen with different ears as a composer. Every time I listen to I was listening to some music by Martin yesterday. I just, wow, I like that. I wonder how he does that. So I'm going to get the score and just see how he does that. That's fascinating.
Isn't that interesting? I do very little composing myself, but I do a lot of arranging. And when I'm in that arranging mode, and then I go to a concert or I play rehearsal, I'm listening to everything differently. I can kind of see the lines. When did you start getting into composing yourself?
Seriously, about 3 years ago. I found, I'd forgotten about it. I'd written a song for my daughter. They were doing a Shakespeare play. So I wrote a song. They needed some music. So I wrote a song for her, which I'd forgotten about. That was 2010. It was about 3 years ago. And I was publishing some music by Bernard Sal, French bass player, composer, really fantastic composer. And these were called Portraits for Friends. And each one was just a one-page piece of music for unaccompanied bass, dedicated to a different player. And I'm number 28, which is really very flattering. And I thought, maybe I'll try that for my students. I'll write a piece for each student. And then I wrote one, and then I wrote another. And then suddenly people started saying, oh, I like that. Oh, well, here you are, have a copy. And then it sort of gave me the confidence to try something else. And then there was another opportunity to write something, so I wrote. And I suddenly found, I'm not Mozart or Beethoven, but people seem to like it, which is nice. And if anything survives me, I'd be more than happy. Really, and I've been very lucky. I've had music played in 8 countries in 3 years, which is unbelievable, really. And maybe Ecuador next month, and possibly Ireland in December. So maybe 10 countries by the end of this year. Wow,
that's amazing, and what a cool new chapter in your musical life. That's got to be just such a creative rejuvenation. Getting into that.
It's really strange because now I sort of ignore every other composer. And I only promote myself now. And I find every concert I do, a few more of my pieces get in. Every time we do a workshop, another piece. And in fact, I'm doing a concert at Oxford University next month. And they asked me, partly because I'm a composer as well, and they're having composition students coming. So they want me to play my own pieces and talk about them. So they get a chance to hear the composer play and talk about their own music. And I love it. I absolutely love it. And I don't know where it came from, because I always thought I had no skill, which is why I worked with so many fantastic composers. People like Tony and John Alexander, fantastic composer, Bernard Sal, Simon Garcia. So many of these are really fantastic composers. And I just think I just tinker a little bit and just write these little melodies which people seem to like. So it's okay.
Well, I've been enjoying. You sent me a couple of your pieces. I've been enjoying playing through and just exploring. I like what you're writing. It's. I find it very interesting. And the tone colors are very. I love pieces that explore like wide sonic palettes on the bass, and I think you're really tapping into that.
As a bass player, how many colors there are and what's possible and what worked really well. And I sometimes I think my music is quite simple. And Sarah, my wife, is recording 2 of my songs in next month. And she had a rehearsal with a pianist. And the pianist said they're so difficult because they're so simple. He said he'd much rather have these big chords, where there's a bit of space to go wrong. He said on yours, it's got to be perfect. Otherwise it's wrong. And I think it's probably because I'm not a great pianist. So I just write for what I can do. But I know what I want. And it says exactly what I want. So thank you for the nice words. That's very kind of you.
Your whole recital program in Prague, there was this very beautifully tied together, and I love the flow of it. And how did you think about, obviously that was a meaningful recital for you because of the Posta, the connection and your visits to Prague, and then there's this big bass event. What was your process putting that recital together? What was your thought process?
I think it took me about 20 attempts to get the program, because I kept changing it. I always I have to know what I start with and what I end with. And then that gives me some kind of idea of what goes in between. And I knew I wanted to play Al-Andalus by Simon Garcia, which I'd commissioned. And I'd invited one of my ex-students, Joe, who's studying now in London. And Danielle, I'd met when I taught him at Prague Conservatoire some years ago. So I knew I wanted to include that. And I'd also written The Last Poppy, my own piece, a trio. So I wanted to include that. Postcards from Prague I had to bring back because that was dedicated to Posta and his wife, Irene. And then little by little it evolved. I like music I like. And I wanted it to be different to everybody else's recital. Because sometimes, there's always Mizek, or there's always Bottesini, or there's always Kuzovitsky, and sometimes it's nice just to have something a little bit different. And Teppo is a great friend of mine. And what's nice there with Teppo is he studied with Posta in the 1960s. And I was there in the 1980s, so we have this connection. And the duet we played was Teppo wrote for me. I got some funding from Helsinki. I think when Posta would have been 90. And Teppo wrote this fantastic piece based on the letters of Posta's name, which is in fact what I used in my piece. And I think it's one of Teppo's best pieces. And Teppo and I premiered it. He came to England and we did a 90th birthday concert for Posta, and we did that. And I played it many, many times. I recorded it last year. And so that one had to go in because of the Posta link. And then little by little, the whole program just sort of decided itself, really. But I have to know, it has to be right. I can't just throw pieces together. I'm maybe quite pedantic, but it must be right. I can't just throw it together. I can't. That's not what I do.
Well, it was great, and the way you spoke from the stage just about the pieces and tied it together, it really enhanced. Sometimes if people are talking in recitals, it can feel kind of awkward or anything. It was just this beautiful flow, and bringing up Teppo, boy, to talk about another person who's had a major contribution to the bass world with the hundreds of pieces he's written, and Simon Garcia. What a unique voice! What a great composer! And when did you discover him?
It's quite simple. We had a competition for, I think, music for quartets, bass quartets. And he sent some pieces, which did really well. And then I said, if you're looking for a publisher ever, let me know. And then from that, I think we've taken about 30 pieces by him. And I had Bass Fest, and I said, would you like to come to Bass Fest? So he came, we had a Simon Garcia concert. One of his pieces, I think we played 3 times. It was so successful. And I commissioned an octet, bass octet from him. And then the following year, we commissioned the trio, which is the Alain Deluth. But he's just such a fun guy. And he's just he never changes. He's always positive. And he's always easy to work with and just so upbeat. And his music, I think, is fantastic. Really fantastic. I'm so pleased to know him. And he's a friend. He's also written pieces for me. And Teppo is, again, different, completely different. Teppo studied with Posta. And I remember Posta saying, you must contact Teppo. You would be good friends. And I think I didn't for a long time. And then Teppo phoned me. And again, he was one of my heroes, because you know of all these names. And he phoned me. I couldn't believe Teppo Hautaho was phoning me from Helsinki. And then he came to Bass Fest, I think it's 97. It's one, I think it's one of the first ones I did. And he came, and then that was it. It was just, wow, great friends. And we have been ever since. And he's written many pieces. I've published, I think, maybe 70 of his pieces, which is a tiny amount of the music he's written. But again, he has something special, Teppo, and he brings something to Bass Fest, and people love him. And he came over in May. He was 75 in May, so we did a Teppo Fest, which I'd done for when he was 70 and 65. And he came over for a weekend, and we had, I think it was 3 concerts and a day of workshop. We did, I think, 20 of his pieces, but over the weekend we played about 100 pieces. And I commissioned lots of 1-minute pieces. I just put it out on Facebook saying we're doing Teppo Fest. If any composer would like to write a 1-minute piece, fantastic. And it had to have some link to Teppo or to Finland. And I wrote 10. And we ended up with about 60 from, 20 countries. It's unbelievable. And we premiered them all and played them all that weekend. And it was just amazing, really. Just the camaraderie. And many friends came to play, my students came to play, but it was difficult to play all these 1-minute pieces. It was, wow, thank goodness we're only 60. It seemed to take forever, because, it doesn't take a minute to learn a 1-minute piece. Often it takes a long time. So I was giving out as many pieces as I dared to each student, otherwise I couldn't get them done. And it was fantastic. We premiered Teppo's Mini Bass Symphony, which was nice. That's the 10 basses, we did it with 16. And he played right at the end. And wow, because he's not a teacher, he doesn't teach at all. And I tell my students, just listen to him, watch him, and that's your masterclass. He doesn't need to say a word, because he just is. And you watch him play his own music, and that's how fantastic it is. I commissioned a piece of violin and bass for a friend of mine who teaches at Wells Cathedral School. She studied at Juilliard and won every prize, going, really fantastic violinist, and had never played any contemporary music, I think, until she met me. And I just kept commissioning these pieces and finding all these pieces. And she said, how do you know how to play Teppo? I said, I know Teppo. And it's as simple as that. When you know him and when you've heard him play, it's simple. It's simple. And he's very good. His music is very good for teaching. I don't know if you use any. Get all the notes on the page, but you've got to find the music. And some students don't like that. Some of them like Botticini, where it's much more obvious. And I love teaching them tempo because they have to find the music and they have to create the music and the colours, and it's completely different. And I absolutely love it when they suddenly, oh yes, that's what it's about. It's like a light bulb eventually going on. It's, right. And then once they like it, they love it.
Cool how different composers' personalities come out in their music. Like Teppo, there's that sort of prankster quality to his music. And then Simon Garcia, you hear his music and you think, of course, this man wrote this music. You know, it just like exudes his personality. I love the idea of these 1 minute pieces. What a cool idea of like a concert of miniatures. That's a great idea.
I've done it before. I had a 1 minute wonders, and I think we had 140 arrive from all over the world. And all my ideas come from other people. I've probably never had one original idea in my life, but I'm very good at not stealing others, but maybe just borrowing other people's ideas. Because often they're really good, but I'm sure they've borrowed them as well from somebody else. Because I think nothing is original anymore. But it's what you do with it. But I just love the idea of a 1 minute piece. And as a composer, it's fantastic because it has to have a narrative. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in 1 minute, you can't waffle. You can't just note spin. It has to say exactly what it is. And I used to compose with a clock, so I could see the seconds. And then I knew whether I had to write a bit more and write a little bit less. And to write 1 minute, it's a great skill. I think every composing student should be made to write 1 minute pieces. Because you just have to write the essence. It has to be there. And there's no time for anything else. I've loved doing it. Did I send you any?
I don't think the 1 minute pieces. No, but that's a great, and I love the image of you writing with the clock like that. How does composing fit into your schedule? Like, do you teach and then at night you compose, or is it like a daily practice, or is you get inspired and you do it?
It's all of them, really. It's if I've decided to write a piece, or I need to write a piece, I like a title first. If I have the title, then suddenly I know which way it's going to go. If I don't have a title, it could go anyway, and I don't like that. But sometimes, someone will say, will you write a piece for me? Of course I will. And they'll say what they want. And again, if there's a deadline, I find it quite easy to do that. But the 1 minute pieces I love. I went to the Finnish Kalevala, the Finnish saga, and there were lots of characters from there. So I was able to find the name and then a little description about it. And that was the thing that influenced each piece. And it was nice to dedicate each one to a different student or a friend. I wrote one for Dritan, who you met from Turkey. And he's recorded many of my pieces. And he's a really great player, really great technique. And the piece I wrote for him was so simple. But that's the piece that came out. It's called Tuenala, which is Land of the Dead. And it's just very, very simple, just pizzicato. It really doesn't, it's just a drone of an open A and then a few notes. Really very, very simple. But it's what I wanted to write at the time. And I apologized to him. I dedicated it. I said, I'm so sorry. It's so easy. I will write you something much more challenging. But it's sometimes, I didn't realize this, that the piece comes out in the way it wants to come out. I hadn't realized this. I hadn't planned to write something so simple, but it's very evocative. And on my bass, the A string is very resonant. And so it's, because I'm always writing on my bass, so I know what my bass will do. And it's interesting hearing other people play my music when their bass is set up slightly differently, and the A string doesn't have that same depth or ring that mine does. And it's interesting, and teaching pupils because they don't have the same skills that we do, and trying to get them to understand how to play it and what I want. And I love it. I absolutely love it. I remember Teppo saying, a good piece doesn't have to be virtuosic. And he came to Bass Fest, and he once played a piece which was just first and second positions. That's all it was. It was mainly first position, and it was stunning, absolutely stunning. And it's 3 jazz pieces. The first one is named Scott, after Scott LaFaro, so it's in the style of Scott. The second one is Charles Mingus, which is much slower, more rhapsodic. And the third one is, the first one is Paul Chambers, that's it. And the third one is Scott LaFaro. And he just gets the essence of each of these players put in first position. You can't believe it. What a skill he has. And I remember he came and played it, and it was perfect, absolutely perfect. And I always remember that it doesn't have to be difficult or virtuosic to be good. Right. So I try and do, some of my pieces are very difficult, and then the others are, well, they're just what they are. It's interesting. It's funny how sometimes, you start writing and you think that's the start of a piece, but as it develops, you find it's not the start of the piece. It's halfway through or 3/4 of the way through. And that was astounding. I hadn't realized that. I always thought you start at the beginning and just went through to it. It doesn't work like that at all. It's so funny. I wrote a piece called Leaving St Kilda. A young bass player at the Royal College of Music needed a piece for his third-year recital. And he just said, would I write something? I said, yeah, of course I will. St Kilda is an island off north of Scotland, and it was inhabited until about 1930. And then the people just couldn't live there because all the young people had left and the old people just couldn't sustain life. And I've always been fascinated by this island. I've never been there, but would love to go. And I called it Leaving St Kilda. And the piece was imagining the very last day as the islanders were leaving to go to the mainland. And I wrote a lament, a Scottish lament. And I thought that was the start of the piece. And it wasn't. I couldn't believe it. It was just 3/4 of the way through. And then I sent the piece, and he liked it, and all the audience and the judges liked it. And then someone said, would I play it? So I thought, well, I better learn it, because I learned it. And I was playing it, and I'd written a 7-bar phrase. I don't like 7-bar phrases. And I didn't want to add another bar. So I just worked out, you just put a few commas in there, so the music stops. And another one. And then it doesn't feel like a 7-bar phrase. I was quite pleased with myself there. I couldn't believe I'd written a 7-bar phrase. Who writes 7-bar phrases? Nobody.
Well, that's funny though, because I love what you're describing, where the piece kind of takes on a life of its own. You're writing, you don't realize you're writing in the middle of the piece, but it kind of just happens that way. So maybe a 7-bar phrase, it was just meant to be for that moment. I love talking about your bass and the resonant A string and how that kind of informs your writing. And I love the sound of your bass. Can you tell me a little bit about your bass?
That's the famous Heifetz one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mr. Heifetz, your your violin sounds very good. And you got it, shook it. Doesn't sound so good now, does it? What a great story. Yeah, I'm so lucky to have this bass. I've known a dealer, a man called Peter Tyler, for many, many years. He's a great friend, and he's an amateur bass player, but he always used to buy and sell basses. And I went to see him one day, and he had a bass from about 1790, most glorious bass, and I fell in love with it. I have never, ever fallen in love with a bass before. And it had black varnish, and it was a beautiful size, and I just loved it. And he'd given first refusal to another lady, and because she knew I wanted it, she thought it must be a good bass, so she bought it. And I was heartbroken. I have never cried over a bass. I can't believe it, because it's only a piece of wood stuck together. But I was heartbroken. I've never been so upset about a bass in my life. And Peter felt really bad that he'd shown me this bass and then taken it away from me. And then a few months later, I went to see him, and he said, "What do you think about that one?" Wow. And when I was about 17, I went down to London for a bass lesson. And when I was young, there were no bass records. You couldn't buy recordings or anything. I had one, which was Hortnagel, playing the Dittersdorf concerto. That was the only one I had in my collection. And I found this record, Ludwig Streicher from Vienna, playing Bottesini. And there was a picture of him on the front with this Viennese bass. It's fantastic shape. And I fell in, that was about age 17. I fell in love with it then. And I went to see Peter, and this was the bass that he'd found for me. He said, "Play the A string." Yeah, got that one. And I played the A string. Wow! Yes, and I bought it. And it's, how lucky am I? My pupils would kill me for it, I'll tell you. They all want to buy it from me. But I love it. I love it. And I love the size of it. I love the shape of it. It just suits me. I love the sound. I tried many different strings. Stefan Krattemacher, I think you met, fantastic German maker. When he was living in London, he sent me some free strings, some Parastro strings, really great strings, but not on my bass. I just didn't like, because every bass suits different strings. Or we all like what we like. So I eventually came on the Dario Helicore solo strings, which on my bass I love, absolutely love. And I've never changed since. I just keep buying the same strings because I know they work and I know they suit the bass. But I like making a nice sound. This is what I say like my students about being musicians who play the bass. And that's what I think I learned from Posta, because Posta was about beauty of sound. And I don't think he ever made a bad sound. I don't think I heard him make one mistake. The very last time I heard him play, I think he was about 70, and he made one mistake, and he just looked over, because he knew that I knew, and nobody else would have known. But every note counted, every note mattered, and that's what I try and do. Whether I achieve it's another matter, but that's certainly what I try to do, and it's what I try and instill in my students, the love of sound. And this is why I talk about the bow, and I say, whose bow is it? It's yours. Whose hand is it? It's yours. Whose arm is it? It's yours. You make the sound. If you make a fantastic sound, you've done it. I've helped you, but you've done it. Conversely, if you make a horrible sound, that's you as well. I'm really sorry. It's nothing to do with me. But it's nice they take ownership of their own playing and their own sound. And we talk a lot about where the bow sits. I did an article for the Strad magazine and talking about bow placement. And I always say between the end of the fingerboard and the bridge, there are 5 points where you can put your bow. And 3 is midway between the end of the fingerboard and the bridge. And 3 will always give you a good sound. So we're aiming for 3 most of the time. And then if we want a bit more sound, more resonance, more projection, 4 is good. If we want a little bit less, 2 and 1. So they can think about the sound. And we do it on workshops. I make them play at 3 and then 1 and then 5, which is right down on the bridge, which they hate. But they suddenly go, oh wow, I'm in charge of my sound. And they suddenly realize it's their sound. And to me, if someone goes away thinking, right, I can make a good sound, I can change my sound, I've done a good job, I'm really pleased with that. So to me, sound is important. And I love this bass so much, I've asked Martin Penning to make a copy for me. I wanted an exact copy, because I love it. And it just means if I have solo tuning on one, I can have orchestral on the other. But it's easier then just to go from one bass to another because it's exact. It's, every bass is different. And coming to Prague, I brought my own bass. I couldn't play on someone else's bass, just because everything's in a different place. The sound is different. And I really like playing on my own bass.
Yeah, it always is remarkable to me watching players who are playing very challenging recitals on borrowed basses. I feel anxiety building for them, Yeah, I love how you put that in terms of the sound. That's something that I think you talk to the best players in the world, and that's what they come back to. It's like, why do you like playing music? I love making a beautiful sound. It's just this simple concept, but really powerful.
But Posta used to play, when he came to the Isle of Man, he borrowed a bass and gave the best recital of the week. He was fantastic at that, really amazing. It's not a skill I have. I can play other basses, but I choose not to. If I can't take my bass, I probably won't play. Because it's you know where your notes are, you know what your bass will do. And if you have a limited amount of time, I know Dan Stifer played, I think, a bass, one of the modern basses. But he's fantastic. He can just pick up a bass and it still sounds like Dan's bass. I love that skill. I don't think I have that skill. I just love my bass.
going back to like the leaving a legacy and the contributions, the 500 plus commissions and recital music and what you've done, you've also started to do things on Facebook that are really remarkable just in terms of leaving a legacy. So like a couple projects, but I'd love to, like Bass Notes is a great example. And thank you for featuring me in that. And I look forward to those coming out.
It's so good to have you there, Jason. It was fantastic.
When did you get the idea to start doing these projects online? They're really quite innovative, and it's just a great way to like we were talking about, leave a legacy, but through that medium. When did you start doing that?
Well, everything changed with the internet, and suddenly, because when I was growing up, you had to write. I remember I wrote to Gary Carr to ask about his records. I got his address, and then I had to wait for his letter to come back, and then I had to write again. And then I had to, and it takes forever. It used to take forever. Nowadays, it's so quick. It's unbelievable. And I think my daughter had Facebook, and I used to think it was a waste of time and everything. And then all my friends were on Facebook. So, okay, so show me what it is. Because I didn't understand what it was. And this is all new. I just need someone to explain it to me a couple of times. And then once it goes in, then I'm fine. And I did that, and I started connecting. I've got 5,000 friends. It's so funny to link to bass players all over the world. But suddenly Facebook meant that I had access to other people and they had access to me. So many players can now email me and say, I'd like to buy some music from Recital Music. I can play these pieces, I can't play those pieces. So I can recommend 10 pieces, which before, if they didn't know who I was or who Recital Music was owned by. So that made it easier. And I love projects. I love always. And the other thing I found was in the past was sometimes I would pitch an idea to an editor of a magazine. They didn't want it. We had a double bass article 2 years ago. We don't need another one. Because, it's often 5 years' time or whatever. So I used to pitch all these ideas and then they didn't want that. Or they'd say, will you write this? And I said, well, no, because I'm not really a writer. I can write about what I know and what I'm passionate about, but I'm not really a writer. And then suddenly I worked out with Facebook what I could do. And I started with a history of the bass in 100 pieces. I always had this idea of the 10 greatest pieces or whatever. I decided to extend it to 100. And it includes, it's one short article about 100 pieces. And I wanted to include pieces which were important, pieces which were maybe unknown or forgotten, pieces which maybe deserved to be better known, pieces which had an interesting story. I loved it. I did one a week. So I did 100 articles over 2 years, and some weeks I'd had enough. I have to say, I'm really fed up with this damn thing. But I'd done 10, and it felt like I was never going to get to 100. And then suddenly I'm up to 92, and then I was having to, which ones am I going to leave out? So I did 100, and it was such a great way of doing it. And I was able to put on CD covers. I got a vast collection of bass recordings, and then I used to put the front cover of publications and photograph of the composers. If the composers were still alive, I'd write to them and say, would you like to write a few words? One of the best ones was Gunther Schuller and the bass quartet, which was written when he was 22. And as I was researching it, I realized that Orrin O'Brien had given the first performance with Fred Zimmerman and 2 other players and recorded it. And I had Orrin's email address. I just emailed her. And I think she'd never written down her memories of this. So she'd written them for me. So it's now in that article, the memories of the first recording and the premiere of this piece. And then ultimately I got in touch with Gunther Schuller before he died. And he was 88 at the time, and he liked the idea of writing his second bass quartet at 88. His first one was 22, and the next one was 88. And then unfortunately he got ill and died. But we had a wonderful email correspondence. So I just used Facebook because I realized I didn't need anyone's permission. Because with the internet, it's given everybody a voice, for good or bad. And I try and use it for good, for the bass. And I just enjoy doing it. Bass Notes just came about because I like projects. I like something. When I've run out of something, I need to start something else. And I thought this would be fascinating for future generations. Because the one thing I've discovered from everybody, including me, is we all play the same instrument, but everybody follows a different path. And it shows younger players that everything is possible. It doesn't matter what you want to do. You can do it with a bass. It's an amazing instrument. And everything is fascinating. And the question I like the best is the last one. very few of us leave footsteps in the sands of time. What do you think your legacy will be? And it's fascinating, the answers. And I absolutely love that. And everybody writes something different. Everybody has a different perspective on who they are and the legacy they leave and what that legacy will be. And it's nice. And many say, my students, which is nice. And that's for most of us, I think, is our legacy is our students. And then their students and then their students and their students. But I just like the idea. And I just email people like I emailed you. Would you like to do it? A couple have turned me down, which I was a little sad about. One, because she was quite a well-known player and just, I think she'd done it before and really didn't want to revisit it. But Joël Leandro is fantastic. She's going to do it. And Catalin Roteru is going to do it. Petru is going to. Thierry Barbet has done. You've done it. Gary Carr, who I've known for, I must have been about 16 or 17 when I first met Gary. And, he's, big superstar, the name in the bass world. And he's my friend. And he's helped me on so many occasions. And just he had the time to write. I can't believe it. Well, I wrote about Alec Wilder for History of the Bass in 100 Pieces. And the pieces were written for Gary. So I just emailed Gary and said, do you have any memories? And he wrote the most fantastic program note about it. And also Vittorio Giannini, which is a name not so well known over here. And again, Gary, I think Giannini was a composition professor at the Juilliard, and Gary was a student. So again, he was telling me all about that. He'd worked with Hindemith. And so it's fascinating that you get the person who knew the composer, because to us, we don't know that composers are now dead. So, and I like to do this with living composers, is would you like to write something about it? Because often they'll say something they've never said before. Because sometimes they'll write a program note which is official and goes in the publication. But then because they're writing for this, it's much more personal. And it's sometimes why they wrote it or why they wrote it in a certain way or what inspired them. I love doing it. And I've started another one, but I've only done 2 so far. A History of the Bass in 100 transcriptions.
Oh, nice.
I think I've done 2, so it's a bit pathetic, really. I will get around to it eventually. The other one I'm going to do when I've done bass notes is write to composers who've written for bass. Because it's fascinating, the composers who are bass players know exactly what the bass can do. And often the composers who are not bass players struggle with it a little because it's a different instrument. And I thought it'd be fascinating to hear from both sets of composers the challenges of writing for the instrument. Because I know sometimes I work within the limitations of what the bass can do. And I think sometimes I should push a little bit harder to push the boundaries. Because I know what it can do. And writing with a non-bass playing composer, they don't know that. So sometimes they'll just push it a little bit harder. And it's maybe what we need sometimes. So it's fascinating, I think, how they all write in different ways.
Well, that sounds like a great project. I can't wait to check that out. And I just want to thank you for what you've done in all these areas of life. And I will link up to bass notes. I'll link up to the 100 pieces and all of that. And folks, if you haven't checked these out, spend some time online reading what David's put together. It really is remarkable. And I just really appreciate the work you're doing. And you're so passionate about this. And me too. And so it's just, I feel like I found a kindred spirit in all this exciting bass world, and the internet's just opened up all these new opportunities.
I think passionate bass players and passionate people are always there. But I think the internet has made it easier for us all to connect. And I think that's the difference. I think it's completely changed because there were lots of people commissioning and lots of people doing what I do and more. But then suddenly we're all connected. And it's fantastic to see what you're doing and what Dan is doing and what Gabriella is doing, what Teppo is doing. And I love it. I like information. I love knowledge. I love knowing what everybody else is doing. Because I always think, is that an idea I could use? Would my students benefit from that? Is that something else I can move forward or something? And I just love it all. I wish I could get rid of this passion. I really, it's so, wow. It's just from the time I get up, Jason, it's hell, absolute hell. I just wish sometimes I could turn it off, but I can't.
Yeah. Well, of all the things you could be addicted to, double bass is probably one of the least harmful.
It's not bad, really, is it? I think it's quite a nice addiction.
Yeah.
But my wife always said she's going to write a book called "If Only I'd Known."
Oh no! I wonder if my wife may be writing the same book as well. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. She always said she feels like a bass widow, and Poor Sarah. She's come to so many bass conventions, and she's sat through so many recitals and masterclasses, and she knows more than lots of bass players. She's had discussions with professional bass players, and they've been astounded that she knew more than they did. But she's very clever, and she knows exactly, the good players, the bad players, why, and she listens, and it's fascinating, really. So she's a bass nut as well, although she won't admit it.
David, what a pleasure. So many exciting things you're up to. Can't wait to follow along with your CD release and everything else that you're doing for the bass community. Very cool. So thank you so much for writing in. I love hearing from folks. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com will get your message to me, or Facebook, or Twitter, if you're a Twitterer, or however, just hit me up, send me a message. That would be great. And thanks for the people that have written in. David Teague says, you're engaging both with the interviewee, but also with the audience. I intended to check a few posts when I found the Thomas Martin interview. I couldn't leave. You choose excellent guests, and your interviews dig out interesting things about them. Thank you for your contributions to the world of the double bass. Thank you, David. It's wonderful. Jason Bray writes in and asks, he says, I swear that you had a blog about a South America bass and cello duo. And there were some YouTube videos that he had saved, but they're deleted. So he asks, does anybody have any recollection of a South American bass and cello duo, or have any information along that? Who those guys were or where they went? And the problem with having 3,000, 4,000, whatever posts I have out on my blog, Decade Plus, is I have like no memory of anything. So I'm sorry, Jason. It's not ringing a bell. But anybody listening, if you have any info about South America bass and cello duo, let me know, and I'll pass the word along for sure. David Craig wrote in from Houston. He's a freelance jazz bass player in the Houston area and teaches. So thanks for writing in, David. Guy Tune wrote in to say hi. Adam Maloney, my feedback, I need to get through some of this faster because this was before Prague. But Adam's a junior at the University of North Carolina, but spending a semester abroad in Vienna. I remember meeting Adam in Prague. Nicholas Villalobos writes in, says he loves the podcast. We talk to the best bass players around, and I learned so much. Keep doing what you do, which is awesome. And one more to share today. Jennifer Stuckey writes in, who's an oboist in Chicago and is relocating to Denver. And I want to say thank you for the podcast and the blog. They're inspiring and say things that need to be said about the career. So that's the first thing she says. Then she says, second of all, I was wondering if at some point you would consider discussing or hosting someone to talk about financial concerns as a freelance musician. I've been out of grad school since 2011 and freelancing auditioning since then, and barely scraping by. And know it's a common problem and a major source of stress with musicians, as many of my friends are mulling over this as well. Since I'm moving to Denver, I'll essentially be rebuilding my career from scratch. So the question of what side job or occupation would work well to support a music career is constantly on my mind. I've mostly spent my time freelancing, teaching, and in the audition circuit, and have felt that a more narrow focus is much needed to make my career successful. Now that I'm moving, I see it as an opportunity to refocus my career. However, the question I'm constantly mulling over in my mind is what side occupation can complement and help support this? What do other musicians do? Can most musicians really make their living off of music? I have for the last few years, but teaching beginning piano, which is not what I really want to do, has been part of that income. And it still hasn't been enough when I consider the costs of unexpected things like cars and life and that sort of thing. I'm really glad to move so I can get out of the vicious cycle that I'm in, but it also forces me to confront the things that I've been thinking about for the last couple of years. Well, Those are absolutely things that I've spent a lot of my life thinking about. And with advice, it's such a tricky thing. I sort of came around to this a few years ago. The best advice is, rather than me saying, here's what I think you should do, the best advice often is, here's what I've done, here are my experiences, and then let people draw their own conclusions from that. That's kind of what I do in this podcast, actually. I highlight these people and you learn and pull. I'm not telling you what to do with this information. You synthesize this. Maybe that's not that helpful, but that's sort of when I've done clinics and talks and that sort of thing, just presenting what I've done and take from it what you can, or let me frame this in a way that you can get some value out of it. I hope I'm making sense. Anyway, So I started writing a series called Crafting a Music Career. And what I'm doing is I've kind of had these 4 phases of my career, I guess, which would be like freelance, just full-time freelancing, and then getting into this whole blog and podcasting thing, which is just this transition zone, but I kind of did create a career out of that. Then my full-time educator career, which I did for 7 years. And then this new phase I'm in where I'm kind of thinking of this podcast as the core of what I do, and everything else is radiating out from that. And I thought it'd be helpful to actually go through and break down like what I did in those various phases, what I earned financially, mistakes I made, things I did right, things I would do differently again, what I liked, what I didn't like. And hopefully that would at least be of some value. So I put out 2 parts of that. It's going to be 5 parts total. I put out just kind of a preface, and then I put out the freelance career aspect of that. I'll put a link in the show notes to this, and it's one of the more recent posts on doublebassblog.org if you want to go there and look. And that's going to do it for today. Lots more listener feedback to get to, but I'll share that in the next few episodes. And again, I appreciate so much you writing in with guest ideas, with news about what you're up to, just to say hi, anything like that. I love hearing from people. It makes me feel like I'm not just sitting here in San Francisco talking into a mic at 6 a.m., which is what I'm doing right now, actually. So thank you for writing in. Love to hear from you. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com. Appreciate your time. I know David appreciates you listening, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.